This podcast is part of the Big Heads Media Podcast Network. Go to bigheadsmedia.com for more great podcasts.
This week on the BiCurean podcast, we welcome guest Jill Tietjen to talk with us about the history of women in Hollywood and a response to the 2020 Oscars.
Hi, I'm Eric.
And I'm Aisla.
And together we are the hosts of the BiCurean podcast.
BiCurean is our answer to the polarizing culture we live in.
Tired of feeling under siege and looking for ways to get involved? Then come be a part of a different way of thinking.
Everything from politics to geek culture to current events that polarize us as a society, we explore multiple ways of looking at things.
Welcome to the show.
I'm very excited to introduce our guest. She's a repeat guest, Jill Tietjen.
Yeah, we loved having you last time, so welcome back.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here.
And we had this idea, actually, when we were talking to you last time. You had written a book, Hollywood, Her Story, an illustrated history of women and the movies. And we thought it would be really fun to have you come on the show and talk about the Oscars and what happened. Because we figured there would be something interesting to talk about, how women were included or not included in that event.
I'm gathering you noticed they weren't that included.
Well, of course we can say they were in the categories of Best Actress and Best Supporting Actress. But yes, there are some very interesting, there are many, many interesting things that happened in the Oscars in February of 2020, which were, by the way, the 92nd Oscar ceremony.
Wow.
The media made a big deal out of the fact that 62 women were nominated in all of the Oscar categories. I will tell you, I have independently done an analysis of the women who were nominated. I get 64. It doesn't matter. Said it was a record, and maybe it was by maybe one or two, but it wasn't a record like by 10. And yeah. So, to make a big deal out of it in the first place caught me a little off. And then there were some pretty significant, at least one, maybe you could argue more, significant categories in which no women were nominated at all.
Yes, I noticed it, and probably partially because we had talked about it previously, and I was paying close attention to it. There was definitely some lack in the categories. Which ones did you notice the most where there have previously been maybe nominations?
Well, interestingly enough, there are 4 categories for the Oscars in 2020 where no women were nominated. The one that got the most attention was the Best Director category, and no women, of course, were nominated in that category. It is important to remember that during those entire 92 years of Oscar history, 5 women have been nominated for Best Director, and 1 woman has won, and that was Catherine Bigelow in 2010 for The Hurt Locker. And then also in the Best Cinematography category, in the 92 years of Oscar history, 1 woman has been nominated. She did not win. That was Rachel Morrison in 2018 for Mudbound. And there were also no nominations for the Oscars this year in Best Visual Effects and Best Sound Mixing. And 3 women have received nominations throughout Oscar history in Best Visual Effects, and 17 nominations have been made of women in sound mixing, of which 10 were for the same woman whose name was Anna Belmer. So maybe it's no surprise in those categories, but it's the same kinds of results that we've been having for years and years and years.
So, and you may not know this, it's kind of out of the blue. I'm just curious, is there any connection between the success of a movie or the popularity of a movie in terms of women directing? So, I mean, is there an argument that women are just not making good films, or are they making films that are being successful but just not being acknowledged by the Academy?
I think it's actually a combination of factors to your question. One of the, I have seen, we'll call them snarky comments. Well, the reason women weren't nominated is because they didn't do good movies. Well, for Best Director. A, that's not true. But B, one of the interesting issues is that in order to be nominated for Best Director, you actually have to direct a movie. And many of my understanding is that many of the ways that directors are chosen for a movie is that a list of potential directors is put together. And it is also my understanding that women are often either not on that list or are way down on the list. So that what happens is the usual suspects get contacted to direct movies, and they say yes, or someone on the list says yes, they're available and they're interested, before a woman is ever asked to make a movie. And so often it's because they don't have the opportunity to do it.
I've definitely noticed that, and there is like this A list of directors. I can definitely see what you're talking about there. One question that I have, and I wonder if you've noticed this as well. It's kind of, maybe it's something that I just feel. But the Academy tends to reward people that are the writer and director, or, you know, even the producer and director. There is an A list of basically, you know, like your average sports team player who shows up and gets the job done, and you see their names on movies, and they may have earned a name in the industry for being able to adequately turn somebody's vision as producer and writer and stuff like that into a movie that is good. Are there any women that you've seen kind of in that role? Or, you know, because I feel like Hurt Locker, that was definitely her baby, like start to finish. And I feel like she was acknowledged because for all that it was Best Director, it was also Best Person who made a whole movie pretty much on her own.
Right. Well, let's just talk about this year. Greta Gerwig was nominated for Best Adapted Screenplay for Little Women. She wrote the screenplay. She directed the movie. The movie was nominated for Best Picture, but she wasn't nominated for Best Director.
Yeah, that one seems kind of obvious.
And I can't remember, I think that for all of the previous, Catherine Bigelow and the 4 other women who were nominated, I believe in all cases, they directed and were nominated for Best Director, and they wrote. And the movie was nominated for Best Screenplay or Best Original, Best Adapted, whatever. I don't have those facts and figures in front of me at the moment. And almost all of those movies were nominated for Best Picture as well. And so, yes, it is often the case that, as you called it, Catherine Bigelow's baby, The Hurt Locker, that women and men tend to become part and parcel of the movie that receives those kinds of nominations.
Yeah.
One of the questions that I had for you was, when you were talking about the research that you did for your book, you were sharing some of the things you discovered about the history of women in film and the ways in which our modern acknowledgments sort of ignore the contributions. And I was wondering if you would be willing to speak a little bit about that context.
Oh, I would be happy to speak about that context. The way we are framing it now, and I've been telling you that we are doing a lot of promotion for the book, so I've been doing a lot of radio, and I'm getting pretty good at these answers. But what we say is that women actually helped found the industry, the movie industry, were the movers and shakers in the very early years in the silent film era. And then what happened was movies started making money, talkies came in, studios started operating, unions came in. The unions didn't allow women to be members. When the movie started making money, men came in and took over. And then what happened was that history was effectively rewritten to write out the accomplishments of women. I heard a statement from Gloria Steinem very recently, and she said, the history and the past are not the same.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
That's a very well said truth.
So I'm going to spitball something out there, because the way that you kind of frame that, and I think about the silent movie era, even, back to like the 1900s into the 30s. And it seems like something, in addition to them making money, something societally happened. Women's roles were suddenly defined by Leave It to Beaver. and I wonder if even Hollywood didn't buy into that idealized 50s roles, even in how they dealt with women that were interested, because obviously they weren't shut out of movies in the beginning.
Right. They weren't shut out of movies in the beginning, and it's actually also a true statement that they weren't completely shut out in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. All during that time, there were roles that were appropriate for women to be in. And that included, costume design, makeup and hairstyling, set design, which is now called production design and has had a variety of names along the way. But all along, women were still, there were just a couple that were directing in those years, in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and 60s, and 70s. Women were screenwriters, and women were editors, and women were involved in other aspects of making movies. It's just that they really, and they were animators, for example. I mean, when you think about it, I've read about this, and there's a new book out about them, the animation that was required for Walt Disney's movies, Fantasia and Snow White and Sleeping Beauty, those movies required an amazing amount of effort by the animators to do cell by cell by cell.
Yeah.
Many women were involved in that animation process. So there were roles that were quote unquote deemed appropriate for the women all along, but then there were others that obviously weren't.
Yeah. Well, and are you familiar with the documentary Misrepresentation?
Absolutely.
So, and we'll link to that, but one of the things that's striking me in what you're saying is that in that documentary, they talked about the fact that female characters became more and more two-dimensional, that in the 30s and the 40s, characters in female characters specifically in movies, had more depth. They could be both the seductress and the girl next door. And that in more modern films, women are a lot more limited. They are and tend to be more sexual objects, even when they are, action-y, and they tend to be more isolated from other women in the stories. And I'm just, as you're talking about the shift in the ways that women could direct and have that power over the stories, it's interesting to me, because I know when I watched that documentary, I was like, that's really shocking to me that in the 30s the characters had more variety and depth, but if women were not part of producing them, I could see how that would happen.
Well, and what you're bringing up is a very important point. There are many quotes in my book that I can't really find flipping through right now that go to this point, which is, if women are not helping write the stories, if women are not writing the stories, if they're not producing, if they're not directing, then the movies aren't reflecting the experiences of half the world. And the perspectives that get told and the stories that get told don't include women's perspectives. I mean, women's friendship is an incredibly important part of most women's lives. And what you already said was that so many of the women in these movies are shown in isolation. That's not women's experiences in life.
Or even worse, in competition.
Yeah.
Like,
Right.
I feel like that's actually more of a trope. If you're going to have two women in a movie these days, like, you can really see if it was probably written by a man, if the women are basically being catty at each other the whole time.
Right. So what happens is we get this very skewed perspective of the world. Movies, for many of us, represent our worldview of what life is like and what people are like. And I've heard statements like what I'm going to say next, which is I met some people who had moved to the US from South Africa. And they said, we didn't want to come to the US because everybody here has perfect teeth. Because all they saw on television and in the movies were perfect teeth. But you can extend that to, well, what if you only see women who are catty with each other? What if you don't see women's friendships and women supporting each other and women helping each other, women and men helping each other in times of family distress? If you don't see those kinds of behaviors in movies, then your view of the world is different than what you're experiencing. And you then start to think that maybe what you're experiencing in your real life isn't the way of the world.
Oh, I've had that disconnection from reality a few times where I realized that, like, everybody's watching the same sitcoms for the most part, the same big movies and things like that. And yet my day-to-day life is not a reflection of that in any way. Even if I'm having a conversation about pop culture with somebody, the reality is, like, everybody's basically detached from that. We watch an idealized version of things. And when you really pick it apart, which is kind of my point of bringing up the way that, you know, I've noticed women, if there's two of them, they are represented in very specific ways over and over and over. And frankly, rather than even write parts for that, we get shows like Big Bang Theory, where there's a token woman on there to be the love interest in some way of at least one of the characters, probably all of them. But really, like, her purpose there is to just be the female perspective, in quotes.
Right. And think of the way that biases our perception of the world.
Yeah. So would you say that, because you didn't look surprised when I started off with the including, not including perspective in the Oscars, was there anything that occurred in terms of nominations or wins that felt like a move in a better direction? Or was it mostly sort of the same old, since you've paid a lot more attention than I have?
Well, there actually was at least one, maybe more, but one that was very cool. One thing that happened that was very, very cool during the Oscars. And you could argue that it was the biggest win of the evening, and that's in the category of Best Original Score. There was a woman who won in that category. And I should actually preface this by saying that over these 92 years of Oscar history, a total of 12 have received nominations in this category. This year, Hilda, and I'm going to really mess up her last name.
Yeah, Hilda. I was thinking about trying to say it too.
Guonadottir won the Oscar for The Joker and became the fourth woman to win in this category. In addition, for the first time in the history of the Oscars, a woman conducted the orchestra that presented the musical scores for all of the Oscar nominees in Best Original Score.
Yeah,
So
I enjoyed that part.
Down as a win.
Yeah. I enjoyed that part, and I have to admit that I'm a musician. I'm actually a composer. I'm not at that caliber, obviously, but that's my default favorite nomination and award in general, because I pay way more attention to scores than most people would. And I knew that she was up for it, and I had heard good things, and we watched Joker a couple of weeks ago, and I was really paying close attention to it because I'd heard such good things about her and what she had done, and it was really good. And I thought it was also very interesting because she's pretty much unknown and from Iceland. There seemed to be a gravitation towards the Academy acknowledging things not from our traditional North American arts. So, yeah, I admit, I kind of assumed they were going to basically give a Lifetime Achievement Award to John Williams because he was nominated yet again for Star Wars. He has said this is the last thing he's doing. So the next award he'll probably be up for will be posthumous, but I was really happy that Hildur won.
Well, there is a category called honorary awards, and it is possible that he might receive one of those at some point.
Yeah, I think he will, and he's been recognized. He's one of my favorite people in general. So, but no, I did think that it was really good that they acknowledged that someone who's somewhat unknown in an obscure movie that, frankly, most people weren't thinking about the soundtrack for. It's a comic book movie, which broke out of its comic book roots a little bit to get more notice, but.
Right. And like John Williams, Diane Warren received her 11th nomination in Best Original Song, and she has yet to win. But there she is, plugging away and getting recognized, at least through nominations, for actually a very significant body of work.
Yeah. That's a... Sorry. Yeah, no, that's a really great step, at least. I mean, I think at least having the nominations, it's like what you were saying before. We can't have someone win or even be nominated for Best Director if they aren't directing. And we can't have someone win if they aren't getting nominated. So that's at least taking us forward. Is there anything that you would encourage people to look for in terms of films? I know that I'm assuming you're familiar with the Bechdel test. It came out a while ago.
It came out actually in 1985, and we have it in our book. And the Bechdel test is whether or not a movie passes the following would qualify it for passing the Bechdel test. And it's really it's actually really amazing that more movies don't pass the test. It has to have two women in the movie who talk to each other, have a conversation with each other about something other than a man. And for extra credit and for really passing, they both have to have names.
Yes.
And that is our minimum right now.
Right. Well, and you were saying the number of movies that don't pass it, the number of movies that I assumed would have, because they have a strong central female character. And that's when I started noticing how isolated women can be in movies, because I was like, oh, this has to pass the Bechdel test. And I'm like, oh, she literally never talks to another woman in the entire movie. Not once.
Wow.
You might see some extras walking by.
Yeah.
It's really weird. They'll have 3 male actors listed and 1 female actor, and that's literally all you see.
Right. Or if there are other women, they're never in a scene together. It's just so and I was like, wow. So we have that, and I don't know if you're familiar with Feminist Frequency. It's a pop culture, women in pop culture website. It's really fantastic. And she sometimes does a Bechdel test review of the nominations for Best Picture. And it's very interesting. And she's clear to say, this isn't to say these aren't good movies. We're just saying they're not women's stories. And so I appreciate the way that she brings out that perspective. But the other piece of it to me is saying, okay, it doesn't mean I'm not going to go see a movie that doesn't pass the Bechdel test. However, I'm going to try to notice that, and I am going to try to expand my horizons to watching movies that pass that test, or that maybe they've altered the Bechdel test for race, and they said, are there two black characters with names that speak to each other about something other than a white person? And it's the same thing, right? Like, how many times? And so try to find films that pass that, but also maybe say, I'm going to try and find like some films that are directed by women, or like, some of these categories where we aren't really getting, and just try to give them some attention, because we do know that to a certain extent that's how things get elevated. If we can go see them in the theater, or, buy them streaming or whatever, get their numbers up, there's a likelihood that more people will have those opportunities.
Right. And what you're really saying is awareness is the first step.
That's a more concise, clear way to say that. Thank you.
That wasn't what I meant to do. I was.
It's good.
Well, Barbara and I have talked about the fact often recently that there's an awareness now of how movies are being put together, and how they're being directed, and how they're cast, and what the topics of conversation are. And that once we have awareness that these kinds of things are happening, then the next step is, and how do we start changing the dynamics of how movies are directed, and how they get made, and how money, because a lot of this has to do with money.
Yeah.
How do movies get funded, and who gets the funding for movies? And if there are movies that have obvious audience appeal for women, and those movies aren't getting funded, maybe there's a way to change the awareness that kind of a movie is not only fundable, but that it can have commercial success.
Yeah, no, that sounds like a good step.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think that's kind of the key, because obviously some movies do better than others, but I also feel like Hollywood's in a place where they don't want to take chances. And right now, even making what would be, quote unquote, a chick flick seems like an area, like I didn't hear anything about Little Women, and it seemed like a good movie. It seemed like it actually did well in the box offices, and you just don't even see like the coming attractions for that stuff.
It was a good movie. I saw it. It was very well done. It was beautifully shot.
Yeah. And like I said, I mean, there just seems to be a certain amount of like, Hollywood will grudgingly make those. They won't really even push them, and then they'll let them just sort of go. And they're putting all of their advertising money and stuff into things they think are sure bets. But I also feel like in general, movies aren't doing as well because they've gotten to a point of a certain formulaic shallowness that maybe people are actually starting to notice, hopefully.
Well, it's so interesting that what you just said, in that so many movies have been made and remade since the beginning of the movie industry. When Barbara and I were doing the research, and we saw that the first Ben-Hur had been in 1907.
Yeah.
Really? And then, the Wizard of Oz has been made multiple times. A Star is Born has been made multiple times. I mean, and there are the movies that are really a retelling of a previous movie, but maybe they changed the location or something else. So they changed the name, but it's actually a remake.
Or based on something that's been made.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Just so fascinating that that's the way the movie
I do have some complaints about the lack of creativity, and that's, I feel like, I'll be honest, I feel like that's where Marvel actually kind of stepped out. There were some formulaic things in it, but in general, it was all kind of new stories that hadn't been done in movie form, and especially at the scale of creating the whole MCU. And,
sure.
and I guess the only thing I really wish is that they had been able to integrate more of the interesting female characters of the Marvel Universe. But they did go with some safe routes in that even. And then it's hard to actually see that too. Like, I have a complaint about, like, I thought Black Panther was a fantastic movie, and I really thought it should win Best Picture. It would have made an interesting statement because not only was it super popular, but it was important in so many different ways for Black culture and Black people in general. And it was widely accepted by multiracial audiences without even blinking. And it had some compelling and interesting female characters, more than one. And I just thought it would have been such a great statement. And, you know, in some ways, that's what makes me feel like they're actually out of touch in the Academy when they do these awards, because it was pretty much the most popular movie with the right kind of messaging that they like to get behind. And, you know, I make jokes with my friends all the time about Oscar Gold. If a new movie's coming out and it's like, oh, this is just dripping with, we made this to win an Oscar. And I mean, that's the fact that I have that feeling about certain movies kind of tells you that the Academy is not only predictable, but probably a little hard to imagine, you know, the ways in which they're in touch with everybody.
Yeah, I can't really comment on the way they vote or anything like that, but I will say just a comment on Black Panther. I have a very good friend who works with an organization called CASA, which is court-appointed special advocates for children who are in foster care. And that organization goes and has its advocates go see movies that address family and dysfunctional family issues. And actually, that is at the base of Black Panther. Dysfunctional issues. So it was very topical for that particular group to go see it, in addition to all of the other messages that were there.
I don't even know if they did it on purpose. It might have been a happy accident that it just had so much of that put together well in one movie.
But it was I think it was a well-told story. I mean, that's what we're looking for. I want to speak to what you guys were talking about with the repetitive movie story experience. And I also want to sort of acknowledge it's actually that's a human condition. I was a student of literature. And for example, the story of Lancelot and Guinevere has been retold numerous times over hundreds of years. It started out as this story of Tristan and Isolde and then was converted to that. And it actually represents archetypes in our cultural history. And so I've never tried to look at like the remaking of movies in that way. But I found that to be actually quite fascinating in looking at some of these stories that get retold, because if you look at the version and the sort of culture in which it was created, usually for like Lancelot and Guinevere, it represents fidelity and love. And it's usually pretty accurate, even without people doing polls. Like somehow the writers tap into what's happening and they channel it through those characters. And so I'd be curious to see if that happens with movies, if they are retold in a way that represents archetypes, or if it is, as we often assume, laziness. But when you were talking about that, I was reminded of my experience with some of those repetitive stories that are the written ones.
I think you're probably right. I mean, I'm remembering when I'm going to show my age here, but I was in 8th grade when the new Romeo and Juliet came out. So that was a long time ago, in the 60s. And we actually, or whenever it was, and we went to see it, because it was Shakespeare and this retelling of Shakespeare with characters that were kind of our age. And I think there was a social sensibility about the way the characters were portrayed at that point in time that did reflect social sentiments, social mores of the age in which the movie was actually made.
So I think I have a new project for you. In case you're looking for another thing to analyze.
I really am, yes.
Thank you for being on the show. We really appreciate you bringing your perspectives to us again. It's always a delight.
Yeah, we love chatting with you about this stuff. And it's always interesting because I often compare what my gut feeling is, and then whenever I talk to you, it's interesting to see what I kind of missed or didn't think about while you are paying so much attention to this. So I really appreciate that.
Well, thank you.
But we'll definitely have you back on. This is obviously a very much an ongoing conversation. I'd love to explore in more detail the ways that we kind of see things changing, because I will say one of my gut feelings is that we're in some sort of pendulum swing back towards cultural misogyny, and for all that we make a gain, it's been feeling like one step forward, two steps back.
Well, I get asked this question actually fairly often, and about where are we going and are we making progress? And it goes back to something I said earlier in this conversation, and that is the awareness is now there about situations, about gender, about race in our culture. And I don't think you can put that genie back in the bottle. It may take a while. And yes, there will be steps forward and steps back, but I have to remain optimistic that real change will take hold.
Well, I really hope you're right, and we'll definitely check in with you in a couple of months and see how it's going.
Yes, thank you.
Great, thank you.
Hey everyone, I'm Kelly.
And I'm Brittany.
And we are the hosts of The Faves of Our Lives.
We're a fairly new podcast that focuses on everyone's favorite everythings.
Each season we talk about a different category, whether it be movies, music, books, etc.
This season, we are discussing your favorite TV shows. Shows like The Office,
Dexter,
Dawson's Creek,
Saved by the Bell, and much more.
You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and many other podcast platforms.
Follow us on Twitter and Facebook at The Faves of Our L1 and let us know all about your faves. That's The Faves of Our L and the number 1.
We hope to become one of your faves soon.
Welcome to the BiCurean moment. In honor of the Hollywood Oscar show, I'm going to talk about Weinstein.
Yeah, and we were kind of talking offline a little bit about it, that it was at the Oscars a couple of years ago now that Seth MacFarlane was hosting and made a little snide comment about Harvey Weinstein. And I do feel like that's when maybe a little bit of a tectonic shift started to happen. The Me Too moment really kind of just started right around then, maybe coincidentally, but it's something that I noticed for sure. And
he spoke out.
Yeah.
And,
but we recently have run into him being found guilty.
Yes, Weinstein was found guilty. And the BiCurean moment for me in that was I was really shocked. Like I got the notification on my phone that the jury was deliberating and we were going to get a verdict. And I absolutely braced myself for the slap on the wrist or nothing. And then for him to have been found guilty on 2 charges was...
But not all.
Well, yeah, it was just... It was not expected, and the fact that it wasn't expected, and I'm not alone in that. There's a lot of women online talking about how their shock that he was actually found guilty is surprising to them, to realize how little trust, little faith they have in the system, and so I'm just noting that I had that experience, but I'm not alone. And what does that mean in terms of the kind of confidence that we have that people will be held accountable when they behave atrociously, and there's genuinely a lot of evidence for it?
Yeah. No, I agree. I think it's great that he was held accountable. And at the same time, my personal fear is that he has become a bit of a scapegoat. like we're just putting all of the Me Too stuff on him, he will go down, and it might lead to other people feeling like, we got him. But there's more than one him.
Right. Well, the other thing, and you talked about this, it was like our second or third episode when we were sort of talking about the Me Too movement, and the other concerning aspect of it was that it was all the court of public opinion. And because of that, there was no actual process for, paying for your behavior in some way and then potentially moving forward in your life. And so I think that this is a good step in that someone has actually been held accountable through the system. And I would hope for that to be more how things go, because I agree, being the court of public opinion, there's some real detriments to that have not necessarily been acknowledged as we have gone through this process. So, it's still problematic, and that's my moment. So
yeah, no, I just hope that it continues in a positive way. It's good to see him get held accountable, and I think it may hopefully give people courage to come forward in other situations, because I as I've said before, I'm not sure everybody should be punished or completely kicked out of whatever it is they're doing for some indiscretions, but in general, if somebody does something wrong, victims should feel like coming forward is absolutely okay, and those people will not only be held accountable, but held accountable in a way that makes it so that the fear of retribution shouldn't even be an issue.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. And I'll also say there's a really great documentary on Hulu called, I think it's Untouchable, about Harvey Weinstein. But when I say great, I mean it's chilling and painful to watch.
Yeah, trigger warning.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't have one. I was like, whoa, I shouldn't be watching this alone. Like, it's very upsetting.
Yeah.
So what was yours? What was your BiCurean moment?
I recently found a Netflix documentary. It was rated a 5 out of 10 on most of the review sites, but I was intrigued to watch it because it's called #Cats, and it's about the rise of cats, cat memes, rock star cats, all of that sort of thing on the internet. From basically, in case people are not up to date, cats are what the internet is actually made of. Pictures of them, videos of them, underneath everything. And I'm only half joking there. Like, they just took off. So it was an interesting concept for a documentary to look into it. But it was also somewhat chilling for me when I realized that our modern gathering Instagram culture is so exploitive. And I actually had a couple of moments where I felt bad for these, superstar kitties that are, they're well taken care of and all of that, but they're also somebody's meal ticket, and their entire life is about more likes and becoming a big enough star to become an influencer so they can get money coming in from the advertisers who are, of course, paying attention to this. And it extends so much farther than cats. It can be about, people in general, influencers that are rising up, what they have to do to get likes and further their own career as an Instagram influencer and things like that. And it was rough. It was actually really not an easy watch. I thought it'd be fun to learn about cats in the internet, but it was striking how exploitive and what is actually taken to become an influencer on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook.
Yeah, and it's that feeling of wanting to remember these are living creatures, right? And to see them being... Again,
they're not being mistreated, but it's very shallow. And, the one person that was on there that was the owner of Little Bub, and if you're not familiar, that was a cat with a pretty severe birth defect. And he lived to be 7 years old, which is way older, but the guy threw him up there in the early days of cat videos and stuff like that. And Little Bob became super popular and has a lot of followers. He passed away late last year. But it was just interesting because even he was like, I don't know that I could do it again. It's saturated because there's so many people who have a cat, and they're all throwing this stuff up, and they're all fighting for it. And it was basically a happy accident, but people believe that this is something that you can do.
Mm-hmm.
And so they just go for it. And we have, close friends that are trying to make their name as a YouTube personality and stuff like that. And it's just really tough. It's so saturated, and the battle to do that almost just looks kind of gross sometimes.
Yeah.
So I encourage people to pay attention to that sort of thing and understand that, if you're following some sort of celebrity who's posting all their pictures of avocado toast, we're buying into something that is becoming an exploitive type of marketing, even though it's guerrilla, but there's just no rules.
Yeah.
So that's my BiCurean moment.
Well, thank you. And thanks for listening. If you have ideas, feedback, thoughts, please find us on social media.
We all play the game.
We are BiCurean on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can also email us at podcast@BiCurean.com.
And if you like what we're doing, please tell your friends about us and share our episodes that you find most interesting.
Thank you.